Hello and welcome to Global News Today, bringing you exclusive interviews with leading experts every weekday here on Arabiya English. I'm Tom Burges Watson. Coming up on today's programme, we'll have all the latest on the 28-point plan, which Ukraine says it has now agreed to, with the goal of ending the war with Russia. We examine what still needs to be done. Plus, as Hezbollah mourn their senior commander, Haitham Ali Tabatabai, who was killed in an Israeli strike, we ask how significant a figure was he, and what message is Israel sending by killing him? Hello and welcome. We begin with the war in Ukraine, where a peace plan to finally end the nearly 4-year-long conflict is starting to gain real momentum. Well, Ukraine has agreed to the latest proposal with only minor details left to iron out. That's according to US officials. Well, this comes after Kyiv repeatedly warned that parts of the proposal seem to favor Moscow, especially the idea that Ukraine has to give up some of its territory. So what happens next, and what exactly would this deal involve? Well, President Volodymyr Zelenskyy says that there's still more work to be done. Well, let's get more now. We can speak to Marina Litvinenko, who is the widow of Alexander Litvinenko, the Russian defector and former Russian Federal Security Services officer who was killed in London in 2006. Marina, thank you very much again for being with us here on Al Arabiya English. Do you think Russia is serious about peace?
Russia not serious about peace. Russia is more serious to make a chaos and take to their side powerful countries as United States or China. And everything what is happening now around of Ukraine, inside of Ukraine, they try to use to make everything what they started to do in 2022, to make Ukraine completely dependent from Russia, losing all identity. And this is all what Russia with the face of Vladimir Putin wants.
What's their motivation then?
This situation is quite difficult. After almost 4 years of this war, and we know nobody expected this takes so long, and for Putin, even living in illusion, everything is perfect. Russia has a great economy, they have a great army. Of course, it's wrong. We have only a lot of people dying in the front line, and Russia having a bigger population than Ukraine, of course, might make some kind of success, but from other side is not. And economical situation is worse. Some sanctions, what might be even more stricter and started earlier, started to work. And of course, Ukraine, they decide to take their own way to sanction Russia, make this all drone attacks and destroyed terminal of oil, some part of an energy system. It means Russia started to feel more this war, and it's quite hard.
So you're making it sound like Russia is actually not in a particularly strong position to negotiate. So why do you think the United States is so keen to get a deal done now, when in fact it might be more prudent to wait and get a clearer picture of what the situation actually is?
When we started to talk about this, it's still not any dialogue. We don't see any leader as Putin, president of Russia, and Zelenskyy as the president of Ukraine are happy to talk to each other. I can't say this is a personal case because we don't know, but we know Putin hates Zelenskyy and he doesn't want to talk directly to representative of Ukraine, maybe somebody else, but not Zelenskyy. And why he tried to prove United States to push Ukraine to agree with all what you just mentioned, 28, but now it's less and less points of this negotiation. And we don't know what might happen tomorrow or after tomorrow. And what points finally would be at the end of the list to discuss. But only things makes me feel positive. They started to discuss about this. For a long time, it was not a real and serious discussion. And what I believe, this is not only United States, not only Russia and Ukraine, it's some more countries behind of all this discussion. Of course, European Union, who wants to be a part of this negotiation. But I don't know who Putin or Trump just decide to exclude European Union from this discussion.
There are some people in Europe who are quite suspicious about the 28-point plan. There are actually some Republicans, some in the United States, who are suspicious about this plan. They've pointed to some of the sentences in the original plan that say they sound slightly strange, perhaps like they were Google translated from Russian into English. And I just wanted to ask you, as a Russian speaker yourself, do you think they're right to be suspicious about that document?
Absolutely. Absolutely. This was nothing what might be, I would say, like this Western mind. This was mostly what might Russian saying and translate to English. This is nothing what Western countries talking before what this peace might look like. This is everything what Putin announced in the first day of this invasion in 2022. Nothing new.
Yeah, so the Polish Prime Minister, Donald Tusk, said it would be good to know for sure who is the author of this plan and where it was created. I want to get your help understanding what he's trying to say there. Is he saying this was less the work of the US envoy, Steve Witkoff, and more the work of the Russian envoy, Kirill Dmitriev, or is he saying something else?
What we know about Kirill Dmitriev and his last visit to United States, and everybody laughing, how was it unsuccessful. But I would like to remind you, even he doesn't look as a hero, but he has a very strong relationship to American business community. He spent a lot of time working, studying. It means he tried to use this not official communication. And we know Witkoff the same. He is not a political trained person. He has just access to Trump. And they might try to negotiate between two of them and bring this plan to Trump without even checking this. For Trump, is only way to finish this war as soon as possible. And if anybody will bring this plan to Trump and it might finish this war very quickly, I think he will accept. But this plan doesn't work.
And when you look at what the Russians wanted in that original 28-point plan, reducing the size of the Ukrainian army to 600,000, saying Ukraine will never be a member of NATO, saying elections must be held within 100 days. What does that tell us about Russia's longer-term goals here?
Again, this is nothing new. This is all what Putin wanted from beginning. And this is not a finish of war. It starts another war. He tried to make Ukraine to feel lost, not supported. And this is just take a time for Putin to start another war and finalize. Ukraine became just like a part of Russia. But it's never happened, because for European Union, it means next war, it will be again against European Union. For America, it might be, doesn't feel so dangerous because they're so far away. But for Europe, it's not. And reduced army of Ukraine, it means you reduced defense of European Union.
So what do you think Ukraine and its European allies should do? Should they engage, or should they simply say, right, we're going to stand on our own 2 feet, we're going to go it alone?
No, I'm sure it should be negotiation. But this needs to be a very strong message. We need to stop a fire. This is all what did happen recently in Gaza. And only after that, you might discuss about 28, 32, 16 points of peaceful agreement. But first of all, it needs to be stopped, because every day, every night, when we watched chronics from Ukraine, you can see people still dying. And Russia killed these citizens without even excuse. This must be stopped. And if Russia wanted to negotiate, again, we don't say now what we agree or disagree. They need to first time stop killing people.
Right, and the killing continued even today. There were fresh deadly attacks on Ukraine. And, you know, Ukrainian soldiers have been dying almost every day for the last 3 years. And President Trump has said that Ukraine's leadership has, quote, expressed zero gratitude for our efforts. Is that how it looks to you? Does Ukraine look ungrateful to the United States?
It's very difficult for me to criticize Ukrainian people. Even they might do a better and maybe say thank you very much every 5 minutes. But you have to be in Ukraine now to realize what does it mean alive when every day, every hour, you might be killed. And sometimes I might feel Ukrainian people just too tough or too stubborn. But it's a different life, and we do need to understand it. After criticize Ukrainian people not to be very grateful. They are very grateful, but they are in a different level of life now.
What do you think your late husband, Alexander Litvinenko, would have made of this situation and the plans to bring about peace?
Since war started, I every time was thinking how my husband knowledge, understanding situation, even predict what these people might do, from Russia's side, would be very helpful to Ukraine, to any other people in the world. But of course, he's not here. But only it's very difficult to say what he might do for this. But I'll let you know what my husband just said before he was poisoned. He makes some very special message in his, it was an article done in his post just a week before he was poisoned in 2006, when he said, until this world, again, this is 2006, until this world just tried to get bin Laden, try to save yourself from terrorism. And at the same time, behind the Kremlin wall, and a monster, very similar to Hitler, just try to collect this blood. If you don't stop him, this might be a war started soon, and million people will die. Unfortunately, not Sasha's words, not Sasha's deaths didn't prevent this a horrible war. But I think it's still people who want to this world would be live in peace. And this is very important to all international community. Doesn't matter where are you, in Europe, in America, in the Middle East, to do everything, this war must be stopped. And not in rules what Putin tried to play.
We often hear people telling us on this channel that President Putin's goal ultimately is to take back every piece of lost territory from the Soviet Union. Did your husband, your late husband, Alexander Litvinenko, ever give you any indication that that was indeed President Putin's longer-term plan?
Absolutely, even more. When Soviet Union collapsed, we knew as a very serious organization named KGB was extended to all of these in the future independent countries like Ukraine, Belarus, Central Asia, even Baltics. And this is influence was till now. Why it was so difficult to Ukraine to get out from all of this control? Because it's not just corruption. It's not only mentally people were not so quickly changed from Soviet time to democratical time. Because of this system, what we called former KGB, was working very hard. And we should remember, Vladimir Putin represents of this system. And it's still very difficult sometimes to survive because the system now rules not only Russia, but still rules other countries, what was former Soviet Union.
Marina, just to wrap up this conversation, if you had a chance to give some advice or a message to President Trump, what would you say to him?
I know Trump has a different agenda about this world, but I think he loves his own family. He loves his children. He loves his grandchildren. And I ask him, remember about this part of his humanity. How are the people who live now in Ukraine with children, with grandchildren, don't have warmth, don't have not electricity, or worried about their own life? And Mr. Trump, as a human, please stop this war.
Okay, well, we really appreciate your time. Marina Litvinenko, wife of Alexander Litvinenko, thank you very much indeed for your time.
Thank you.
Well, let's get more now. We can speak to Captain Brent Sadler, who is a former US military diplomat, now a senior fellow at the Heritage Foundation Center for National Defense. He joins us from Washington. Captain Sadler, thank you very much indeed for speaking to us here at Arabiya English. I'd just like to start by asking you, I mean, a lot is happening in terms of dialogue. We've got talks between Russia and Ukraine in Abu Dhabi. That's been happening today. There were talks on Sunday between the United States and Ukraine. And just in the last few hours, we've heard reports that the US and Ukraine have reached an understanding on the terms of the peace deal. How significant is all of this in your view?
Well, it is a significant development, to be clear, but still far from the goal or the end state, something that both Moscow and Kyiv can agree to at least stop the fighting. Putin also late yesterday has already signaled that this is not acceptable. So we'll see what further trading and adjustments are made. But the fact that Zelenskyy is hoping to get on an airplane and come to D.C. in coming days to solidify his agreement, or at least his support for the first revision to this deal, is significant, to say the least.
Yeah, and do you think President Zelensky's played his cards quite skillfully here? Because by agreeing to this deal, it means that Russia, not Ukraine, is going to be seen by Washington as being the next spoiler. That's assuming Russia doesn't agree to this deal.
Yeah, I think all parties, quite frankly, are playing this a lot more seriously. And certainly Ukraine's attempts right now, and also to visibly get on a plane and come to D.C., would underscore Russia as the outlier. Whether or not it's effective or has any impact on Moscow softening its position is to be seen. And I think until there's real pressure on the battlefield, as well as economic pressure on China and India, these are the two biggest sources of income coming into Moscow's war coffers, I think it's going to be an open question whether or not we're going to see any real give from Moscow's perspective.
Now, it's been reported, and it's not verified, that the US Secretary of State Marco Rubio told some senators that the 28-point plan didn't reflect the administration's position. Instead, he said it was, quote, essentially the wish list of the Russians. I wonder what you read into that. And do you think that suggests some sort of a split or an unease, at the very least, in the ranks of senior Republicans with regards to the current strategy?
Well, I mean, the bottom line is it really doesn't matter, because as soon as that draft was taken to Kyiv, it was adjusted. And it will be adjusted again when they take this new version to Moscow. So the bottom line of this is no matter where it came from or what the language was that started it, it's been effective to kick off what seems to be a very meaningful and substantive dialogue between Moscow and Kyiv to get to a state to where the fighting can stop.
And in your opinion, is there no alternative to the 28-point plan, which, as we've been saying, might no longer be 28 points? Some suggesting it might now be a 19-point plan. Is there any alternative to that, or is that the only way to go? And I'm really, the extension of that question is, could Ukraine not be given the means to defend itself to a greater degree and to go on the attack, and then perhaps to renegotiate when Ukraine, not Russia, was in the position of strength?
Well, from an American perspective, it's most important that this is an enduring peace because the United States needs to shift more of its military focus to Asia, where there's a very real possibility of a major war that would be far more destructive and far more consequential, at least for Americans, if China is not deterred. So it is in America's interest that it's a workable deal. And that's, I think, the most important metric to be evaluating this. And to get there, the front line or the line of contact between the two militaries, they have to have a realistic way in which they stop the fighting, withdraw from each other about 20 kilometers on either side, in a way in which the Russians nor the Ukrainians are in a favorable military position to restart conflict. And the other thing that's important to note, there's been no mention of the Black Sea, and I think that needs to be addressed. And maybe it is, it just hasn't been made public yet.
But in terms of, I mean, okay, you mentioned that there's concern in the United States about developments on the other side of the world. But doesn't that reinforce the idea all the more that the United States and its European allies should be strong together and stand united? And instead, you know, I mean, it does look slightly like the United States has blindsided the Europeans and railroaded this deal without really including them. And that's not conducive to building and maintaining strong bonds with allies, is it?
Well, many of the NATO countries, though they've contributed significantly, it hasn't been decisive to get Moscow to move towards a ceasefire on its own. And it certainly hadn't helped lead Ukraine to a better posture for an opening to a ceasefire that's workable either. But what's most important is that Kyiv and Moscow come to an understanding, not necessarily what the rest of Europe thinks about in the sausage making of this deal. Of course, once the fighting stops, NATO countries need to be ready to provide independently the military support Ukraine needs so that a resumption of hostilities doesn't occur. But to date, those nations are not yet able to defend themselves, let alone provide additional military support to Ukraine. So there's a lot of work that NATO countries need to do in the meantime, rather than complain about not being in the room when some of the details are being negotiated.
But they are buying the weapons. The Europeans are, well, via NATO, the weapons are being provided to Ukraine and being paid for by the Europeans. They are being supplied by the Americans, but essentially the Europeans are US clients of this weaponry.
Well, that's because the previous administration's approach was unsustainable and got us into what is the Russians' favored tactic in military conflict, and that is an attritional warfare. The reality is the defense industrial base, the production of munitions and platforms like jet aircraft and tanks in Western Europe or NATO countries is inadequate to the task. And it's going to take several years for them to address that. And that's job one for NATO, quite frankly, to try to get that defense industrial base up and running to prevent or to outpace a Russian rearmament once the fighting stops. But the United States is the only one right now that's got the capacity. And it's the only one that the only military that the Russians respect, quite frankly. So really the United States is the key ingredient to getting to a ceasefire, or at least the threat of more provision of munitions and other equipment with less strings attached to the Ukrainians. And this is what I was getting at for real cost on the battlefield to really change the calculus in Moscow.
Sure, we heard the French President Emmanuel Macron saying, we don't want a peace deal that would be a capitulation. Those are his words. But when we look at the terms, and I agree with you that these terms may have changed and we don't yet know what's changed from the 28-point plan, but things like ceding territory, accepting to reduce the size of its military, enshrining in the constitution that Ukraine will never join NATO. I mean, how is that really any different from a surrender?
Well, a surrender would be the total capitulation and the collapse of the government in Kyiv. And that's not what's in store here. It's actually, I think I do have differences of opinion on some of those points, and I think they will get revised and perhaps changed because it doesn't set up a sustainable peace. But the reality is it actually protects the sovereignty of Ukraine. It actually addresses the economic necessity to have a sovereign and viable state of Ukraine that's independent from Moscow. And so I think at its core, it's certainly not a capitulation. And again, France is not in any position to actually try to equip or arm Ukraine to take by force of arms all of the territory that Russia's taken. So there is a necessity of dealing in reality here and not rhetoric, which will only just mean more Ukrainian deaths. And it can't be a proposition that NATO countries like France would put and say, continue the fighting until the last Ukrainian either.
One thing that I haven't heard about for a very long time, and do correct me if I'm alone here, but the minerals deal was something we talked about a lot on this channel, and it was very important to the Trump administration in about February of this year that Ukraine signed that deal, and in return for its mineral wealth, it would get US protection. Why is no one talking about that anymore?
Well, I think everyone realizes that the mineral deal can't happen until the fighting stops. And so the focus is on trying to stop the fighting along the front line. And again, this is really the main focus. I think the economic deals, the rebuilding are all critical for if Ukraine is to remain a viable sovereign country. It needs to have an economy that is free to access the global market space through the Black Sea, which is why I mentioned that the silence in all this so far is somewhat troubling. But also, of course, with anyone that so chooses to do business with, to include the EU membership.
Okay, Marco Rubio, the US Secretary of State, seems to suggest that this deal is something of a Google translate of a Russian document. And, other people we've spoken to have said something quite similar. I mean, what are your thoughts on that? Or do you think that's largely irrelevant and it was really the springboard for discussion, this whole idea?
Yeah, I look at the effect or the results that we're getting. It doesn't really matter, quite frankly, where it originated from at this stage. It's getting Kyiv and Moscow to actually address the reality that it's created. And that is an opening for a potential viable ceasefire that could lead into a lasting peace that then can also result in some real meaningful rebuilding in Ukraine and perhaps in the long term, a settling of formal borders between Russia and Ukraine. Again, that's the other thing is the two countries need to settle officially and formally what their borders are. There's no real clear delineation of where those would be yet.
Okay, and just lastly, Captain Sadler, we heard the Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelenskyy saying a couple of days ago, Ukraine risks losing its dignity and freedom or Washington's backing. I mean, neither a particularly appealing scenario for his country. Which one do you think it will be?
Actually, I think it's a false kind of proposition, or at least a kind of test that Zelensky's putting there. It's really a question of national survival. And that's really what's at stake. And I think that's what he needs to be focused in on. Putting in like dignity. I mean, what's more important is actually having a country that you can rebuild and protect your people and your culture and your history than a sense of dignity, quite frankly, at this stage, because they've been 3 years of fighting. I think they've proven their dignity and certainly the veracity of defending their country at this stage.
Okay, we're going to leave it there. Thank you very much indeed for your time today. Captain Brent Sadler, thank you very much indeed. Meanwhile, NATO has today scrambled jets following the deepest drone breach yet into Romania. Romanian and German fighter jets were deployed near the border with Ukraine to intercept a Russian drone incursion. Well, Poland has urged NATO to step up defences on its eastern flank. Well, let's get more now. We can speak to Ambassador Alessandro Minuto-Rizzo, who's a former Secretary General of NATO. Thank you very much indeed for taking the time to speak to us. The latest we're hearing with regards to all the dialogue that's taking place, there are talks between the Russians and the Ukrainians reportedly in Abu Dhabi today. There was talks on Sunday in Geneva between the United States and the Ukrainians. And it's been reported that the United States and Ukraine have now reached an understanding on the terms of the peace deal. How encouraged are you by these various reports?
Well, I think that the good news is that we have now some kind of ideas in written form, because up to a few days ago, there were many ideas just floated in the air, but nobody understood anything about a practical plan of peace. Now we have, the good news, I say, is that we start to negotiate finally. The bad news, if you like, it is the text is written in Russian, more or less. Now I'm overdoing it a little bit, but there is a heavy Russian accent in the plan that has been presented to Ukraine. Anyway, good news is that Secretary of State Rubio has come in, because in that group of people around the president, he's in my view, the best professional, because he's a former senator, Secretary of State, National Security Advisor. So I think that he takes a little bit more, how can I say, of a professional touch to these negotiations, which are in a way very, how can I say, very new, because in the history of diplomacy, as we all know, we don't make, peace plans in television, press conferences, 25 commas, just publicized, perhaps, maybe not. This is a bizarre way of doing things. Also because what it looks like, if you look at the big picture, what it is interesting for us, is that we see that the two sides are not negotiating directly, Russia and Ukraine. What you have Russia somehow represented by the United States. Is not exactly so, of course, I understand that. But, the Americans are discussing with the Russians. And the Europeans are supporting the Ukrainians. This is new. And I hope it's successful. The problem that I see is that it is a very complex affair, because you can call it 25 points, 28, 19, doesn't matter. There are many, because you go from the land, from territory, to guarantees to Ukraine, to the Russian Orthodox Church, bilingualism, what you do with the Russian assets, a lot of things. What it is, to my view, from a diplomatic point of view, the first point that you have to solve, because usually this is always the case, is the problem of territory, of land. And the president of Ukraine, Zelenskyy, yesterday or the day before yesterday, he said that at the Swedish parliament. He said, first thing we have to fix the problem of land. And what's the complication? Because I think that we have to explain it a little bit to non-specialists. The Russians have more or less occupied, let's say, 19 to 20%, more or less, of the territory of Ukraine. But what is in the American plan is the fact that the Russians should get a part of those provinces occupied by Russia, which is not yet occupied by the Russian troops. And this is a very, very delicate point, because to give up something that you have lost, you can accept it, or perhaps in a way or in another. But the fact that you have to give up something which has not been conquered by your enemy is, I think, from a ecological point of view also, and political, very difficult. So I don't know how they are going to solve this issue. Okay. And then, of course, okay.
Yeah, so I mean, you've made lots of interesting points. And one of the first points I want to pick up on is how you said this was essentially a Russian document. And we've been hearing that from other guests as well, that somehow this Russian text was Google translated into English and became the 28-point plan. Now it's less than 28 points, and Ukraine has agreed to it. And that means that the ball is now in Russia's court, and if they object to it, they are the ones who are the spoilers, if you like, viewed from Washington's perspective. That was quite strategic on the part of the Ukrainians, wasn't it?
What is new, I think, in this very psychological also game, is the fact that Ukraine, in this last part of 2025, seems to be more inclined to make some concession. Because you remember that up to a few months ago, there was no way that you could have Zelenskyy or the government in Kiev saying that it would give up territory. The magic word was territorial integrity. Now it is not that anymore. Of course, again, we have to be very careful when we explain things. What Ukrainians are ready to give up, and Europeans, I think, agree with that, is that that land which is occupied by the Russian army will remain in Russian hands. But careful, it doesn't mean sovereignty. It means that it's occupied. And perhaps it will never happen, I think, but maybe in terms of dreams, you can think that in 50 years, perhaps things will change, it will come back. It is a sort of Korean solution, if you like, in a way. So you don't have a treaty, but you have a line of demarcation where people live in peace since a long time.
One of the points I would like to ask you about, given your NATO credentials, is that one of the conditions in the original 28-point plan, and we don't know if it's still in there, is this idea that Ukraine should enshrine in its constitution that it will never seek NATO membership. I'd like to ask, I mean, that sets an interesting precedent, doesn't it? And a massive implication here for NATO, because apparently NATO can no longer choose who and who is not a future member of the NATO alliance. What do you make of that?
Well, it's very interesting. I think you're right to point at this because it's very psychological. That's why I think, it has been written by the Russians, because for them, NATO is a sort of obsession. Too much, I think, too much. NATO is not an aggressive organization. Never try to aggress Russia, but this is a different views. We can't help it. This is something true. But it's if I can speak frankly, I think that the membership in NATO is not on the agenda. It has never been on the agenda. Also because of a very simple, very basic things, that there is probably no consensus that is needed among the NATO members. There are 32 now, 32 countries. And it's sufficient that one country, Greece, Portugal, I don't know, whoever you can choose, says no, the country will never come to become a member. If you take the case, for instance, a little bit forgotten, if you like, of Macedonia. You remember, Macedonia asked to be a member of NATO since 2005, something like that. But it could not because Greece was opposing the entry of Macedonia into NATO because of the name, because they were afraid that there was a confusion with the Greek region of Macedonia. And so, in fact, the Macedonians called the country North Macedonia, which is now the agreed name. And 5 years ago, they entered into NATO. So for 20 years, the entry of Macedonia, a small country of 2 million people, have been blocked just because of a name. So, you need a consensus for that. And Ukraine, everybody understands, I think, that Ukraine doesn't need to be a member of NATO, if I may say so, with my credentials. It doesn't need to be. There is one point, if I may, which is very important, and it is a little bit overlooked into all this, that NATO seems to be a sort of, a red blanket. It is something that is not possible to accept. This is one thing. But on the other hand, the European Union seems to be all right. And this is, again, a little strange, because I think that for the future of Ukraine, in the end, the European Union is probably more important than NATO in the end, in the long range, because of economic reason, society, whatever, is more important. But probably for the Russians, they never understood very well the European Union, because it's not about military force, it's not by power, it's more soft power, a pacific entity in their eyes, more than in reality. And so for them, the European Union, there is no veto on that. And this is very important also for the Ukrainians.
Okay, so NATO membership is not on the table, and that was one of Russia's demands anyway. But there were other Russian demands, red lines. They want elections within 100 days in Ukraine. They want Ukraine to limit its military by a half to 600,000 soldiers. What do you think some of these Russian demands tell us about what Russia's longer-term objectives might be?
Well, longer-term objectives by the president of Russia are clear. He wrote articles about that. Texts, he thinks that Ukraine belongs to the Russian culture, Russian mir, to the Russian world. This is his opinion. And he thinks that the dissolution of the Soviet Union is the major catastrophe of the 20th century. He had said that. So he dreams to get back Ukraine into some kind of Russian influence, perhaps like Belarus, more or less, something like that, And if you remember, 3.5 years ago, when the Russians attacked Ukraine, one of the main reasons which were given by Vladimir Putin, the president, was that Ukraine has to be denazified. It was considered to be a Nazi regime. And then, of course, you understand that if in that kind of optic, to have elections in 3 months after peace would mean, in their eyes, in their view, that Zelenskyy has to go. And the friendly government possibly, I don't think is the case, but that's what they dream. A more friendly government could go into power in Kiev. I think this is what they aim. But it's a little bit of a dream, I think. It's not realistic.
Okay, and just lastly, some European countries are very uncomfortable with the negotiations as they stand right now. Some European leaders have expressed discomfort, some form of objection and skepticism towards this whole process. And one thing we're hearing is that perhaps later on down the line, Russia will use false flag operations, claim that Ukraine breached the terms of the ceasefire deal, and then re-invade Ukraine. Do you share that concern?
There is a literature on that. In my personal view, I think that the aggression which took place in 2022, February 2022, was out of a miscalculation. A little bit like it happened with the Americans and George W. Bush in Iraq and Saddam Hussein. What do I mean by that? The idea that Putin had, probably suggested by somebody, as I imagine, was that the government in Kiev was very weak. It was very weak, that there was a very strong pro-Russian sentiment in large parts of the population. And so it was necessary just to push it a little bit, and Ukraine will fall, and it will become a second Belarus. Now, what I think personally is that an agreement sooner or later will be found. But Russia has proved not to be the superpower they pretend to be, because they paid an enormous price to this aggression. So even if they gain a few provinces, which may be possible, I think, but the price is a country which has been completely militarized. Many people who went away, young men, just to avoid to go into the military service. The exports of raw materials, gas, oil, decreased enormously. So I don't think that if there is an agreement, as I hope now in Ukraine, in the future there will be another invasion of Russia. I don't think so. What I dream myself is that there is a reasonable compromise by which Ukraine maybe loses what it has lost. It stops there. Elections in due time in Ukraine, why not? Perhaps some concession in terms of language to some Russian minority, it can be done. In my country, in Italy, we do it. For German-speaking population, for instance, it's not a problem. But, in the end, things are where they are. And the moment Ukraine gets full membership into the European Union, it will happen at a certain point, perhaps in 10 years, but it will happen. Then what can Russia do about that? And then we can maybe start again to have a normal relationship with Russia, because, don't forget that Russia, in the past, in the 19th century, for instance, was part of the concept of nations in Europe. They were present at Waterloo against Napoleon. They played a role after the fall of Napoleon. They have been part of of Europe. They have religious Christian roots, let's put it that way. I think it is possible at a certain point, when we solve this crisis, slowly to go back to a situation where Russia can become, again, I don't know how much it will take, but not part of Europe, but a real good partner. It is possible.
Okay, we're going to have to leave it there. Thank you very much indeed for your time. Ambassador Alessandro Minuto-Rizzo, former Secretary General of NATO. Thank you very much indeed for your time, sir.
Good evening, sir.
Now, for the first time in months, Israel has struck Lebanon's capital, killing Hezbollah's acting chief of staff, Haytham Ali Tabatabai. Well, the strike came despite a US-brokered truce, which was reached a year ago. Well, Hezbollah said the attack crossed a red line, though it's still unclear how the group will respond. Well, Lebanon's health ministry has reported that 5 people were killed and 28 others injured during that strike. Well, we can speak now to Michel Helou, who is the Secretary General of the Lebanese National Bloc Party. Michel, thank you very much for joining us on Arabiya English. Always a pleasure talking to you. There's lots I want to talk to you about.
Thank you, Tom.
Let's start with the funeral yesterday of the senior Hezbollah commander, Haytham Ali Tabatabai. 4 other people were killed with him on Sunday. I'm assuming there was a mixed reaction, was there? Those who support Hezbollah who'll be outraged, and those who don't, who probably think he deserved it. What would you say has been the overall reaction?
Absolutely, Tom. You're totally right. There are 2 very different, actually opposed reactions. One of it is a reaction of grief and of rage against Israel, which is mostly the reaction of Hezbollah supporters. And then the other reaction is actually a mixed reaction of anger towards Hezbollah, but also towards Israel, and maybe a bit of despair and sometimes a bit of resignation, in a sense of disillusion and loss of hope. And what happens is that we're actually living in a very polarized country, where the majority of the people today do not understand Hezbollah anymore, and it's pretty clear that Hezbollah has lost the huge part of the support that he used to have, specifically outside of the Shia community, knowing that even within the Shia community, there is also a substantial share of opponents to Hezbollah who actually believe that this person, Tabatabai, had nothing to do in civilian areas, that not only he should not be in civilian areas, he should actually give back his weapons, that Hezbollah should disarm as a whole, and that we should try to find a diplomatic way to end the conflict with Israel.
Okay, so clearly we're talking about a high-ranking military official in the form of Tabatabai, some saying the most senior figure in Hezbollah to be killed since Hassan Nasrallah in the autumn of last year. What message do you think Israel is sending by targeting him and killing him?
I mean, what's pretty clear first is that Israel does not care about international law, does not care about the ceasefire agreement, does not care about all the rules that are set, does not care also about targeting civilian areas. Let's not forget that the bombing, the attack happened in Harat al-Harik, which is a densely populated area in the suburbs of Beirut, the southern suburbs of Beirut. However, all of that we knew, and we know that. The message is very clear. It's a continuation of the behavior that Israel has been taking on since October 7, which is a behavior of basically there are no boundaries, no limits to the affirmation of Israel's military hegemony in the region, and specifically in Lebanon, given that we're talking about Lebanon. And there Israel has shown very clearly that they're ready to go till the end to basically get rid of Hezbollah and of any threat that Hezbollah could represent to them. And again, as I said, they don't really care about neither international law nor targeting civilians nor whatsoever. So this is the message: is we are ready to go until the end. And Lebanon, unfortunately, is paying the price.
Right, and of course, Iran, a supporter of Hezbollah, their Revolutionary Guards are urging revenge. How likely do you think that is, and what do you think Hezbollah's options are at this stage?
first, I'd be very glad from the Iranians that if they want to take revenge, well, let them take revenge as Iranians. Let the Revolutionary Guards, launch their own rockets if they really want to do that. Let them stop using us Lebanese as cannon fodder. I think we've had enough of it. It's been 40 years that Lebanon has been paying the price of foreign influences and interventions and foreign wars on our soil. It has cost us the country. So I think it's pretty fair to say that we should stop that. And that, first of all, not only it's unlikely that Hezbollah will retaliate. It's unlikely because they simply do not have the military power to retaliate. And we've seen how they've been behaving since the ceasefire. Hezbollah does not retaliate, does not send any attacks on Israel because they simply are not able to do it. And that would basically cause total havoc and disaster on the country, given also the power balance. Israel has a total military, cyber security, surveillance hegemony over Lebanon. So we really don't have the luxury of engaging in a war. So I think overall, very unlikely. And the Lebanese government should make this even more unlikely by really implementing what we had promised in terms of disarmament. It's also Lebanon's job. And this is something really important. This is not only towards Israel. This is the Lebanese government towards its own citizens. They promised us that they would disarm Hezbollah. Well, it's been 11 months now since the new regime, the new president, the new government have been elected and put in place. So we really need actions on that front.
Right. And Michelle, I think your sense of impatience is also felt by Washington. They sound increasingly irritated with the lack of progress on that front. I mean, has there been any progress in disarming Hezbollah, or is this simply mission impossible?
There's been very limited progress on that front. The main job that was done is south of Litani, where overall they've been, removing the remaining weapons there. And there's been some work that has been done. And we have to thank the government and the army and all the security services for that work that has been done, mostly at the customs, the port, the airports, the land borders, preventing Hezbollah from, trafficking drugs and weapons, and also bringing in some financing. However, the reality is that Hezbollah has been able to circumvent all that and has been able to rearm. And we've seen several reports on that. And this is a real problem. And not only they've been able to do it, but they actually say it very loudly, explicitly. They're telling everyone in Lebanon, we will not disarm. Not only will we not disarm, we will also rearm. And we will be ready for more wars and more fighting and more confrontations against Israel or against others, because we don't really understand against whom they are fighting. 2 weeks ago, Naim Assem, the current chief of Hezbollah, said explicitly, we are not a danger for Israel's northern cities, and we are just rearming. And then the question becomes, then why are you rearming? Are you rearming to actually, wage a war against Israel, or given what you said, are you rearming to wage a war against Lebanon, or who do you intend to use your weapons against? And this is the question that everyone is asking today, regarding Hezbollah. Now, whether the Americans or not are impatient, clearly the Americans are impatient. They want to see more action, and they want to see results on the disarmament front. And I think that, we don't have the luxury to see our relation with the Americans affected. We don't have the luxury to lose this relationship. So we actually have to take on this disarmament implementation plan the fastest, because it's become extremely urgent.
Okay, Michelle, clearly since November of 2024, when the ceasefire was signed, 127, possibly more, Lebanese civilians have been killed by Israeli strikes in the interim. And I'm just wondering whether there's a sense of nervousness in Lebanon right now that this uptick in Israeli action within Lebanon's borders could be a prelude for something perhaps a little bit more broad in terms of Israeli military action. Is there that sense of concern right now?
Definitely. And this is the disaster part of all of this, which is that it's actually more than 300 Lebanese that have been killed since the ceasefire was signed. Overall, it's more than 4,500 Lebanese that were killed, 16,000 people were injured, dozens of villages that have been reduced to rubble. So the reality is that our situation is disastrous, and our civilian situation, our humanitarian situation is disastrous. There are still dozens of thousands of southern Lebanese people that have been, that had to flee their homes and that have been displaced, and they're not able to come back. So there is a huge urgency. However, neither Israel is obviously doing anything to help us on that front. They keep bombing and destroying, and they've been using phosphorus bombs actually right this week. But neither the government nor Hezbollah are actually doing the job, specifically Hezbollah, which in the end are here to preserve their raison d'être, their reason for being, which is their weapons. So Hezbollah is currently ready to see the last square meter of our land being burnt entirely, as long as they keep their weapons with them. They really don't care about the civilians. And this is what we're witnessing every day. Hence, there is a lot of nervousness, as you said, because we know that Israel will intensify its attacks. And on our side, we are not being up to the task of responding with the proper diplomacy, with the proper disarmament plan. So this will leave Hezbollah and Israel against each other, and it will cost us maybe the country once again. So we Lebanese, and specifically Lebanese people from the south, will pay the price of this confrontation.
And just lastly, Michel, the Pope is going to arrive in Lebanon on Sunday, on the 30th of November. It's part of his first foreign trip since being appointed to the papacy, and therefore a real opportunity to capture the world's attention. Is there a feeling that his visit might actually change anything there in Lebanon?
I mean, I think that the Pope's visit is definitely a positive sign. It brings a lot of hope in a country where faith is something very important, be it Christian faith or faith in general. I think that a lot of Christians and Muslim Lebanese do hold the Pope in very high esteem. So for them, it means a lot. However, I think it's also pretty clear that the Lebanese want to see action. They want to see proper change from the policies of the past. They want to see a new regime, a new president, and a new government that actually have the courage to take on the real fundamental problems of our country, which are basically first, disarmament of Hezbollah and the return of the sovereignty, and also second, all the fundamental reforms that have to take place, the financial and banking reform, the electricity reform, all the fundamental things that allow our institutions to function properly, which we haven't had for the last 20 to 30 years. So I think this is really the focus of the population. Obviously, we are lucky to welcome the Pope. I think it's going to be a beautiful moment, a moment of unity, a moment of prayer, and in a sense of bringing people together. But I also really believe that the Lebanese are expecting much more than that today.
Okay, well, we really appreciate you taking the time to speak to us. Thank you very much indeed. Michel Henry, the Secretary General of the Lebanese National Bloc Party. Thank you for your time, sir. Well, that is all we have time for on Global News today. Thank you very much indeed for watching. Be sure to join us again tomorrow for more exclusive interviews. Until then, goodbye.